This is a Rencong. Now, I got this as a gift a few weeks back. I didn't know very much about Rencongs at that point, except that they were knives from Aceh. So I took the time to do a little bit of research around it, and I thought I'd share it with you. Now, I'll try to give you a close-up here. You can see that there are ornamentation on it, which is based on vegetation, which is very typical of Islamic culture. There are smaller ones on the other side. I don't know if you can see it or it just disappears, but supposed to be able to see it. Yeah, you can maybe see it here. And this has some ritual or magical purpose. The scabbard is basically two pieces of wood which are sandwiched together, probably glued because they are very well fitted, and then these iron bands or metal bands are placed around it to keep it in place, but I think they are also glued in place. It absolutely looks that way to me. The handle is very special. Now, having a curved handle is very common in Southeast Asian weapons. This one, however, curves not the way you'd think. Because if I'll just pull this one out. This one, as you see, curves this way. Now, in almost every other weapon from Southeast Asia, it would have curved this way. But this one curves this way because you're supposed to grab it like this. You're supposed to wield it edge up. Now, of course, you can hold it like this. It's possible, and if you find yourself in a position where that is the most useful, then you'll do that. But it lends itself ergonomically a lot better to be held edged up. And from what I have read, this is the way they were mostly used, edge up. Now, as you can see here, the blade actually protrudes at the base, forming what would be like a finger guard. So actually, your thumb kind of fits very nicely below this part to assist in a thrust. It's a very narrow blade, but actually, I don't know if you can see it, it's pretty wide at the back. You see here? As opposed to the edge, which is very thin. This makes this blade very stiff, which is awesome if you're going to thrust. Now, one person I showed this to said, "Oh, it looks like a filleting knife," and of course, if it would have been very thin, I would have agreed with him. But it's very hard to see. I just showed him a picture. And it's very hard to see from a picture. That's why I really want to show you the back here. You see how thick this is? This blade is really, really stiff, and it's supposedly to make it, you thrust in and you cut out. You thrust in and you cut out. As I said, this one is from the end of the 19th century. That's around the time of the Aceh Wars. Now, the Aceh Wars is pretty interesting conflict. And it kind of plays a little bit into this one. So, basically, it's a long story, but I'll try to give you a very short intro about it. The Aceh Wars was a series of conflicts, rather, in the end of the 19th century, basically between the Dutch colonial powers and the Kingdom of Aceh, or the Sultanate of Aceh, rather. Now, the Sultanate of Aceh at the time was really, really rich. They basically had a monopoly on black pepper trade. And remember, Southeast Asia was known as the Spice Islands at the time, and actually very much later as well. So the spice trade was a huge thing, and this was bringing in lots of wealth to the Aceh Sultanate. The whole thing starts off where, as colonial powers do, the British Empire and the Dutch colonial powers, they decided to say, "Oh, you know what? The British says you can have Sumatra if we get this little country here on the west coast. If it was the Ivory Coast or the Gold Coast, I don't remember at the time." But anyway, they make this deal, and the problem is that part of Sumatra is actually Aceh, which wasn't under British or Dutch control at the time. It was a sovereign nation, and it had pretty good international relations. It had good, very strong trade relations with the United States. It had relations in part with Britain and also with Italy. and it was a protectorate under the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire, as you probably know, was known as the sick man of Europe at this time. So the idea that they were a protectorate was more on paper than probably in reality, which shows up later on. Now, in all of this, there winds up being a meeting between American officials and some Italians and the Aceh. I believe it was trade negotiations, and this was held in Singapore. Now, this is important because Singapore was part of the British Empire at the time, and the Dutch see this as a violation of this agreement, and they decide to invade Aceh. Maybe they kind of had their eyes on Aceh for a long while and just looked for an excuse. What do I know? Anyway, they decide to invade Aceh, and Aceh was fairly rich, but only had a standing army of about 10,000 soldiers. However, within an amazingly short amount of time, they managed to increase their army tenfold. That's like 100,000 standing soldiers, and modernize it in large part through the help of countries like Great Britain and Italy and America. And winds up that the Dutch actually pretty much gets their asses kicked. Not like, completely defeated, but, this war has to go on for like over 30 years before the Dutch finally prevail. And actually, they didn't really conquer them completely. I'll come back to that. The thing is that for a long while they tried to invade, and they did different kind of tactics. At a point, they actually wound up controlling Banda Aceh, which is and was the capital of Aceh, and they thought that now we have Aceh, and then actually they kind of controlled Banda Aceh due to a cholera epidemic, which basically left the city vacant almost, and so conquering it wasn't that big of a deal. And then the Sultan actually died. But when the Dutch said, "Yeah, the Sultan died. Now we have conquered Aceh," but the Aceh they just chose one of his sons as an inheritor and made him the new Sultan. So before they pretty much managed to do anything, there was a new Sultan. So what they tried then was they tried to occupy a few of the other coastal towns, and then they said, okay, so to the local secular government, they said, listen, you guys work for us, the old tactic, divide and conquer, right? You work for us and we'll give you money. And they took the money and said yes, and then sent the money to funnel it into the Aceh resistance. So basically, the Dutch wind up paying the Aceh for fighting against the Dutch, which of course isn't very useful from a Dutch point of view. Now this went on, as I said, for a long time, and actually there was popular resistance well into the 20th century, and in many ways the Aceh they are fiercely independent and view themselves as an independent nation still, even though they are now officially part of Indonesia. To the point where there actually is an exile government, which of course isn't recognized by Indonesia, and probably, to my knowledge, isn't really recognized from many countries. But it proves that they are still viewing themselves as an independent people. So that was, the Aceh Wars. And as I said, this wasn't like one war. This was basically more like a series of conflicts that drew on throughout this period. And one of the reasons that, coming back to this knife, one of the reasons that the Aceh was so successful in fighting the Dutch was that they basically resolved to using guerrilla tactics. And this weapon, as you may have guessed already, isn't something you go start fencing with. This isn't a large battlefield weapon. I mean, probably Aceh soldiers were carrying these on the battlefield as well, because they are quite central in Aceh culture. But they aren't, if your enemy has a rifle, you're not going to pick up this and run at him. Or you could, but you're not going to get very far, in all probability. However, in guerrilla warfare, where you kind of sneak in and, stab them in the back, or, when they're not expecting it, or do short, small raids and stuff like this, then weapons like this become really useful. So this, as I said, it's the Rencong. It is late 19th century, and it was, as I said, kind of like a sneaky or assassination type weapon. But it also has a central part in the Aceh culture. Also, it is associated with some magical properties, which is really common with weapons in Southeast Asia. The kris is most famous for, you know, being possessed and being able to fly out at night and killing your enemies. But there's also magical properties associated with this weapon. And just like the kris, as I talked about, here you can see that the blade protrudes outside of where you'd grip it, so forming some sort of finger guard. And this is also the case with the kris, and also with what is sometimes referred to as a kris sword or a sundang, where it actually forms a parrying guard, or yeah, almost like a cross guard, which actually protects your hand while fighting. So you can see here that the steel, the blade, is actually, the steel that makes the blade actually stops here. So the blade that isn't like fitted into the grip at this point. It actually transfers into what becomes the tang, which is as wide as the handle, and then disappears into the grip, becoming the tang, and then you have this wooden grip just for ergonomy on the outside. So it's up until this point, it's actually pure metal, which makes it fairly heavy, but also makes the balance very, very close to the handle. This also lends to the theory that this isn't really a chopping weapon, right? Because if you want a chopping weapon, you'd probably have the weight distributed somewhere out here. But I mean, look at it. This isn't a chopping weapon. It has an edge, it is sharp, it can cut, but it isn't primarily a cutting weapon. This is a thrusting weapon or stabbing. So, I hope you found this interesting, and maybe you will read some more about Rencongs from Aceh. If anybody knows more than me, I'd be happy to read about it or hear your thoughts. And please write in the comments down below. Alright, and if you enjoy these videos, then please subscribe and maybe click like, comment. If you think I'm an annoying idiot, then just ignore me. Alright? Thank you. Bye-bye.